The airport was unusually quiet in that early hour, the kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. A woman stood near the departure gate, with 3 children gathered closely around her, each holding small bags that looked too big for their hands. Her suitcases were neatly lined beside her, organized with care, as if order could hold her emotions together. In her hand were the boarding passes, slightly crumpled from how tightly she had been holding them. Her face remained composed, unreadable to anyone passing by, but her eyes told a different story. Tiredness that had settled deep over time, and a quiet finality that came only after long suffering. There was no one here to see her off. No dramatic farewell, no voice calling her name, no last-minute apology or attempt to stop her. Only silence surrounded her, broken occasionally by distant announcements echoing through the terminal. She looked down at her phone one last time, almost hesitating, almost expecting something different. Instead, what she saw was a post that made no space for her existence anymore. Her ex-in-laws were smiling brightly in a decorated home filled with balloons and laughter, celebrating a baby shower. The caption announced the mistress's pregnancy with joy, surrounded by heart emojis and congratulations. For a brief moment, everything inside her went still. Not anger, not heartbreak, just acceptance. She didn't cry. She didn't react. Her thumb slowly pressed the power button, and the screen faded to black, as if closing a chapter that had already ended long ago. Around her, life continued normally, unaware of the quiet storm she was walking through. The departure board above flickered, and then displayed her flight number, glowing softly as if calling her forward. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself, then reached down to take her children's hands. Their small fingers wrapped around hers without question, trusting her completely. And then she moved. Step by step, steady and unshaken, she walked toward the gate without once looking back, leaving behind a life that was celebrating her absence while she stepped into the unknown with nothing but silence and freedom. She was not always this quiet, this distant version of herself. There was a time when she believed in love deeply, when marriage meant partnership, and when building a home felt like building a future together. She gave everything she had to that belief. Her days were filled with responsibility and care, managing the household with precision, raising her children with patience and warmth, and supporting her husband's ambitions without hesitation. She celebrated his smallest wins as if they were her own, and she ignored the early signs that something was slowly shifting out of place. At first, the changes were subtle enough to excuse. He became busier, more focused on work, more distant in conversation. The late nights started as occasional delays and slowly turned into routine absence. Messages were left unanswered, calls were returned late, and excuses replaced explanations. The warmth that once existed between them began to fade, replaced by short responses and prolonged silences that felt heavier than arguments. Trust didn't break suddenly. It eroded quietly, day by day, until it no longer felt like something she could hold on to. His family added another layer to her isolation. They never openly rejected her, but their approval always felt conditional. There were constant comparisons, subtle remarks about how things should be done, and an unspoken expectation that she adjust without complaint. She learned to smile through comments that stung and remain polite in spaces where she never truly belonged. For the sake of her children, she endured it all, convincing herself that stability mattered more than comfort. Then came the truth she could no longer ignore. Another woman entered the picture quietly at first, hidden behind secrecy and half-truths. But secrecy never stays hidden forever. It became visible in fragments, messages, rumors, shifting behavior, until the reality was undeniable. And eventually, it was no longer just betrayal. It was a pregnancy announced without regard for her existence in the same story. What hurt more than the betrayal itself was the response that followed. Instead of accountability, she was met with silence, avoidance, and subtle blame. As if she were the problem standing in the way of someone else's happiness. As if her years of sacrifice had no weight at all. She stayed longer than she should have, holding on not because she was blind, but because she feared breaking the life her children knew. But slowly, painfully, she began to understand that staying was costing her pieces of herself she could never regain. Leaving was never a sudden decision. It was the final step of a journey filled with exhaustion, quiet endurance, and the realization that survival sometimes means walking away from everything you once tried to save. The truth didn't just come out, it was displayed, celebrated, and normalized in front of everyone. What once was hidden behind secrecy was now openly embraced. The mistress was no longer a shadow in the background. She had been welcomed into the center of the family without hesitation. The pregnancy, which should have carried complexity and silence, was turned into an occasion of joy. Decorations filled rooms, smiling photos were posted online, and captions overflowed with celebration as if nothing in the past had ever existed. She saw it all without needing anyone to tell her. A single glance at social media was enough. There were pictures of family gatherings where she was absent, replaced by laughter that felt foreign to her life. She was still legally tied to the man at the center of it all, still carrying his name in paperwork and records, but emotionally, she had already been erased from the narrative they were building. No one confronted her about it. No one explained anything. There were no difficult conversations, no apologies, no attempts to acknowledge the damage. Instead, there was silence directed at her, as if ignoring her presence made the situation easier for everyone else. Even people she once considered close began to distance themselves, unsure of what to say or simply choosing not to say anything at all. Friends noticed her quietness, but none of them pushed too far. Relatives avoided sensitive topics, shifting conversations away whenever her name came close to the truth. Her husband offered no explanation either. No effort to repair what had been broken. No acknowledgement of the life they had once shared. He moved forward as if her emotions were irrelevant, as if silence was the same as resolution. And in his mind, perhaps she would accept it. Perhaps she would stay silent forever, as she always had before. But inside her, something irreversible began to change. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with tears or outbursts. It was quieter than that, deeper, heavier, permanent. A shift that marked the end of waiting and the beginning of understanding. From that moment on, her focus changed. She began to think not about saving the marriage, but about saving her children from the chaos surrounding it. Every decision started forming around their stability, education, emotional safety, financial security, and a future where they wouldn't inherit this pain. Each moment of humiliation no longer weakened her. Instead, it gave her clarity. Every post she saw, every ignored message, every silent rejection became another reason to move forward. She stopped fighting for a place in a story that had already moved on without her. Instead, she began quietly preparing her exit, step by step, with only one goal in mind: freedom for herself and safety for her children. The decision didn't come in a moment of anger or emotional collapse. It came in silence, after long nights of thinking, observing, and understanding that nothing around her was going to change. She no longer saw her life in terms of fixing what was broken. Instead, she saw a future that needed to be rebuilt from distance, away from the environment that had slowly stripped her of peace. And so she made a choice, not to run away from life, but to step into one where she and her children could breathe again. She decided she would leave the country with her children. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but with complete awareness of what it meant and what it would take. Every detail began to fall into place under her quiet direction. Documents were gathered carefully, travel requirements checked and double-checked, school records reviewed and transferred in preparation. Financial arrangements were made with patience and precision, ensuring that nothing would be left uncertain when the time came. Yet to everyone around her, life appeared unchanged. She smiled when needed, spoke when spoken to, and carried on as if nothing was shifting beneath the surface. No one suspected anything because she never allowed them to. Her husband remained convinced that she was emotionally bound to the family structure, unable to step outside it. His parents assumed the same, that she had nowhere else to go, no resources strong enough to support independence. That belief gave them comfort, a false sense of control over a situation they had long stopped paying attention to. But they were wrong. She already had everything planned. Tickets were secured. Bags were packed slowly, with only essentials chosen carefully so as not to raise suspicion. More importantly, she prepared her children in a way that did not create fear. She spoke gently about change, about new beginnings, about safety and opportunity, ensuring they felt her strength rather than her worry. Through all of it, she never once acted out of revenge. There were no confrontations, no emotional outbursts, no attempts to make others understand her pain. Her strength existed in restraint, in the quiet certainty that she no longer needed validation from the people who had stopped seeing her. She chose dignity over drama. Every action she took was rooted in clarity, not chaos. And on the night before departure, when the house had finally fallen silent and her children were asleep beside her, she sat quietly in the dim light and looked at their peaceful faces. For the first time in a long time, she felt something steady within herself, not sadness, not fear, but control. In that moment, she understood that she was no longer waiting for life to change. She was changing it herself. The airport felt different from every other place she had been in recently, strangely neutral, as if it existed outside of emotion altogether. People moved in every direction with purpose, unaware of the silent weight she carried as she stood there with her children. Their small hands remained tightly wrapped around hers, trusting her completely as she guided them forward. The check-in was smooth, the security line uneventful, and no one asked questions that could have changed her mind. There was no dramatic farewell waiting for her. No voice calling her name. No footsteps rushing behind her to stop her. Only the steady movement forward and the growing distance from everything she had once called home. Each step through the terminal felt like she was crossing invisible lines between the past and the unknown. Behind her was a life filled with silence, betrayal, and acceptance of pain she had carried far too long. Ahead of her was uncertainty, but also space to breathe. Her phone kept lighting up with images she didn't need to search for anymore. The ex-in-laws were still celebrating, still smiling, still immersed in the world they had chosen. Bright decorations filled the screen, balloons, laughter, gathering photos, and cheerful captions announcing the pregnancy as if it were the beginning of something pure and perfect. It felt like another life entirely, one she was no longer part of. She stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, not out of pain, but recognition. Then, slowly, she pressed the power button and turned it off. The screen faded into darkness, and with it, she cut the final digital thread tying her to that world. The contrast was almost unbearable in its simplicity. One side of life was celebrating loudly, embracing a future built without her. The other was moving quietly toward departure, carrying everything important in small suitcases and even smaller hearts that depended on her strength. Her youngest child looked up at her and asked a simple question about where they were going. She knelt slightly, brushing their hair back with a calm smile that hid everything she felt inside. "A new place," she said gently. "Somewhere safe." The answer was enough for them. As boarding began and they stepped onto the plane, she felt the air change once more. The noise of the airport faded behind her, replaced by a strange stillness that felt almost unreal. She guided her children to their seats, fastening their belts carefully, making sure they were comfortable before settling in herself. Through the window, she saw the world outside preparing for takeoff. And as the plane began to move, she took one long, steady breath, not of sadness, not of loss, but of something quieter and more powerful. This was not an escape. It was a beginning. The moment she stepped out of the airport in a new country, everything felt unfamiliar in a way that was both overwhelming and strangely peaceful. The air carried a different rhythm. The faces around her spoke languages she was still learning to understand, and even the simplest tasks required patience and adjustment. For a moment, she stood still with her children beside her, taking in the reality that this was now their life. Nothing was familiar, yet nothing here carried the weight of her past either. The first days were not easy. There were moments of frustration when communication failed, moments of exhaustion when money felt tight, and quiet nights when memories tried to return uninvited. But even in those difficult hours, there was something she no longer felt: regret. Leaving had stripped away comfort, but it had also removed the constant emotional burden she had been carrying for years. Slowly, piece by piece, she began rebuilding. She focused on stability first, finding ways to secure a small but safe living space where her children could feel settled. Enrolling them in school became one of her first achievements, and watching them adjust, even slightly, gave her strength she didn't expect. Every small task, opening accounts, understanding systems, finding resources, became part of her new reality. She began exploring opportunities for herself as well, looking for work, training, or education that could give her independence. It wasn't about rushing into success. It was about creating something steady enough to stand on. Each step forward, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost over time. Her identity started to shift quietly. She was no longer defined by what she had endured. She was no longer seen through the lens of a failed marriage or betrayal. Instead, she became what she was building: an independent mother creating a stable life for her children with her own strength. The pain from the past didn't vanish completely. It lingered in memories and quiet reflections, but it no longer controlled her daily life. It became something she could acknowledge without being consumed by it. And slowly, something changed within her. Smiles began to return. Not because everything was perfect, not because life was suddenly easy, but because she finally felt something she had not felt in a long time: freedom. And in that freedom, she found the beginning of peace. Back home, life continued as if nothing had been lost. The pregnancy was still being celebrated openly, proudly announced as a blessing that brought joy and renewal to the family. Gatherings remained frequent, filled with smiles, photographs, and carefully staged happiness. The same people who once overlooked her presence now acted as if everything had fallen perfectly into place. But beneath the surface, something began to shift. The initial excitement slowly started to lose its shine as reality quietly settled in. Responsibilities increased, expectations grew heavier, and the day-to-day pressure of maintaining the image they had created began to build. What once felt like celebration started to feel like obligation. Conversations became more practical, less joyful. Small tensions appeared where none had existed before. He, who once dismissed her so easily, now found himself facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. Decisions carried more weight. Demands increased. Stress became a constant presence that no celebration could fully cover. The ease he once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a growing discomfort he couldn't quite name. Yet the most unsettling change wasn't in what remained. It was in what was missing. She was no longer there to manage the silent burdens she once carried. No longer there to absorb tension, solve problems quietly, or maintain balance in ways no one had fully appreciated at the time. Her absence began to show itself in subtle gaps, in moments where things didn't run as smoothly as they used to. And slowly, without dramatic realization, it became clear that life had not simply moved on. It had changed. In the end, there was no loud confrontation to remember, no dramatic revenge that defined her story, and no moment where she needed to raise her voice to prove her worth. She never fought battles in public, never begged for fairness from those who refused to see her value, and never tried to force understanding from people committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she made a choice that required far more strength than any argument ever could. She left. And in leaving, she rebuilt everything piece by piece for the sake of her children. A new home, a new rhythm of life, and a new identity that was no longer shaped by betrayal or silence. Every step she took forward was quiet, but intentional. Every small achievement became a reminder that survival was not enough, growth was possible. Her story became a reflection of something deeper: that silence is not weakness, but control. That walking away is not failure, but courage. And that sometimes the most powerful victory is not being chosen, but choosing yourself. Freedom, she learned, was worth more than approval ever was. And while others continued to celebrate a version of life built on appearances, she was building something real, something stable, something that could not be taken away. She didn't stay to watch their celebration because she was too busy saving her future.